Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Some secrets are not buried with the dead. They are merely hidden, waiting in the ruins of forgotten places. Tonight, we follow Philip Feltram as he is drawn back to his ancestral home, the desolate Clustead house, by a mystery he cannot ignore. The letter, found in the cold, dark heart of Mardyke's Hall, had become a lodestone in Philip Feltram's soul. Its brittle, yellowed paper felt like a relic from another world, and the frantic, faded script it contained had burned itself into his memory. The words spoke of injustice, of a secret child, and of the unforgettable tragedy of Mary Feltramis' own ancestor. But it was the final, desperate plea for the rightful heir to be known that had truly taken root in his mind. It was more than just a historical curiosity. It was a personal summons. Since that night in the attic, a profound and unsettling restlessness had settled upon him. He could not eat, he could not sleep. The normal, predictable world had receded, replaced by a constant, nagging sense of an unfinished story, a story in which he was now an unwilling participant. He felt a deep, undeniable pull, a silent and insistent call from his own forgotten bloodline, urging him to seek answers where the tragedy had first begun. The letter was a key, but the lock was not at Mardyke's Hall. The lock, he knew with a certainty that defied all logic, lay across the dark, still waters of the lake, in the skeletal ruins of Clustead House, the home his ancestors had lost to sorrow and shame. It was a place he had only ever seen from a distance, a jagged silhouette against the fells, but now it beckoned to him with the irresistible force of a forgotten duty. The morning he chose for his pilgrimage was unervingly still. The world seemed to be holding its breath. He procured a small, simple rowboat from an old fisherman down by the shore, a man whose eyes were as gray and cloudy as the lake itself, and who asked no questions as Philip pressed a few coins into his leathery palm. The boat was old and weathered, its wood softened by years of water, and it moved with a heavy reluctance as he pushed it from the gravelly shore into the icy embrace of the lake. The water was like a sheet of black, polished glass, its surface perfectly smooth and unmarred by even the slightest ripple. As he rowed away from the shore, the familiar world of Golden Friars began to recede, its quaint gables and the solid, comforting shape of the George and Dragon dissolving behind him into a featureless gray. He was leaving the world of the living and venturing into a place that belonged to memory and mist. He had not rowed for more than 10 minutes before the fog began to roll in. It did not approach from the horizon. Rather, it seemed to materialize from the very surface of the lake itself, rising in thin, ethereal tendrils that coiled and twisted like ghostly serpents before coalescing into a solid, impenetrable wall of gray. The fog was a living entity, cold and damp, and it swallowed the world whole. The far shore vanished, then the near shore. Soon, he was adrift in a featureless, silent void, the boat a tiny, insignificant speck in an infinite expanse of gray. The world was reduced to the small circle of his immediate surroundings, the dark, oily water directly beside the boat, the weathered wood of the hull, his own pale hands gripping the oars. The fog muffled all sound, creating a profound and unnatural silence. The rhythmic splash of his oars as they dipped into the water and the gentle creak of the oarlocks were the only sounds in the universe, and even they seemed muted, absorbed by the thick, cotton-like density of the air. It was a silence that felt ancient and absolute, the silence of a world before creation, or perhaps after its end. The cold was a physical presence, a damp, clinging chill that seeped through his coat and into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air and everything to do with the deep, dark, and reputedly bottomless water that lay just inches beneath him. He rowed on, guided by a strange, internal compass, a sense of direction that came not from sight but from the insistent pull in his soul. Time seemed to warp and distort in the gray nothingness. He felt as if he had been rowing for an eternity, a lost soul condemned to an endless, monotonous task. The fog played tricks on his eyes. In the swirling mists at the edge of his vision, he saw shapes that were not there, the looming prow of another vessel, a hand reaching up from the water, the fleeting silhouette of a figure standing on the surface before dissolving back into vapor. He knew they were illusions, phantoms born of the mist and his own frayed nerves, but the knowledge did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He thought of the stories he had heard in hushed tones at the George and Dragon, the local legends of the drowned woman, of Mary Feltram herself, who was said to rise from the water on moonless nights, her face a mask of grief, her dead child held out in a silent, eternal plea. He gripped the oars tighter, his knuckles white, and tried to banish the images from his mind, focusing only on the steady, rhythmic pull and release of the rowing. He was not just rowing across a lake. He was rowing through a sea of ghosts, through the very story that had brought him here. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog thinned. It was not a gradual clearing, but as if a curtain had been swiftly drawn aside for a single, dramatic reveal. Through a sudden, unexpected break in the thick gray wall, he caught his first glimpse of the shore, and there it stood, Clustead House. It was not a house, not anymore. It was a skeleton. The ruins rose from the misty shoreline like the bones of some great, prehistoric beast that had crawled there to die. The roof was entirely gone, leaving the interior open to the unforgiving sky. The stone walls, once proud and strong, were now broken and jagged, their sharp, black lines cutting into the soft gray of the fog. Empty, gaping holes that had once been windows stared out at him like the vacant eye sockets of a skull, dark and devoid of all life. The entire structure was draped in a thick, choking shroud of dark green ivy, its tendrils creeping over every surface, a relentless, vegetative tide that was slowly pulling the stones back into the earth. It was a monument to decay, a testament to the absolute power of time and sorrow to obliterate all that man builds. The sight was both terrifying and profoundly sad. This was his heritage. This was the home of his ancestors, the place where his own tragic story had begun. The brief vision held for only a moment before the fog closed in again, swallowing the ruin as quickly as it had revealed it, leaving Philip alone once more with only the haunting afterimage burned into his mind. He knew he was close now. The pull was stronger than ever, a physical ache in his chest. He rowed with renewed purpose, and soon the bottom of the boat scraped against a gravelly shore. The sound was harsh and grating, a violent intrusion into the silent, misty world. He climbed out, his legs unsteady, and pulled the small boat as far up onto the bank as his strength would allow, securing its rope to the low-hanging branch of a dead, skeletal tree whose white, barkless wood looked like polished bone. He stood for a moment on the shore, a desolate strip of black pebbles and mud, and looked up at the ruins that now loomed directly before him, half hidden in the swirling mists. The air here was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and carried the thick, cloying smell of wet stone, rotting leaves, and something else, the faint, sorrowful scent of damp, decaying wood smoke, as if the ghosts of 1,000 fires still clung to the stones. He had arrived. He had answered the summons. And as he took his first step from the shore towards the broken, ivy-choked walls of Clustead House, he could not shake the feeling that he was not just stepping onto a piece of land, but stepping directly into a memory of a tragedy that was not yet over. He had come seeking answers, but a cold, deep dread began to settle in his heart, a terrifying premonition that the secrets of this place were secrets that were never meant to be found by the living. Philip Feltram stood before the gaping maw of what had once been the main entrance to Clustead House. The great oak door had long since rotted away, leaving only a dark, arched void in the crumbling stone wall, an open mouth that seemed to breathe a silent, cold welcome of decay. The air that emanated from within was heavy and ancient, a potent and layered perfume of sorrow. It smelled of damp earth and wet stone, of the slow, patient rot of fallen timbers, and the green, living scent of the ivy that was relentlessly consuming the entire structure. Taking a steadying breath that did little to calm the frantic bird fluttering in his chest, he crossed the threshold, stepping from the misty gray of the outside world into the deep, shadowed gloom of the ruin. He was immediately struck by the sheer scale of the desolation. He found himself standing in what had clearly been the main hall, a space designed to impress visitors with the wealth and stature of the Feltram family. But now its grandeur was a bitter mockery. The roof was completely gone, having collapsed inward generations ago, and in its place was only the vast, indifferent and colorless gray sky. Where once there had been polished flagstones or fine wooden flooring, there was now a thick, uneven carpet of lush, green grass and hardy, flowering weeds, a wild and untamed garden growing inside the house's very heart. Sunken patches in the earth hinted at a collapsed cellar below, and piles of rubbly a chaotic mix of fallen stones, splintered beams, and shattered roof slates were heaped in the corners like the discarded bones of the house itself. The great fireplace, once the soul of the hall, was a cavernous, black hole, its immense stone mantelpiece cracked down the middle, its hearth choked with debris and pale, ghostly-looking fungi. The stone walls, stained dark with a century of rain and weeping moss, rose up around him like the sides of a canyon. High above, where the second-floor gallery would have been, a series of empty doorways opened into nothingness, silent portals to a sheer drop. It was a place of profound and absolute emptiness, a hollowed-out shell where the only remaining residents were the wind and the slow, creeping passage of time. The sheer, overwhelming sadness of the place was a physical weight, a pressure on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. This was not just a ruin. It was a wound, a place where a great and terrible violence had occurred, and the scar it had left on the world had never truly healed. He began to walk, his footsteps unervingly quiet on the soft, damp earth. The ruins were deathly still, encased in a silence that was far more profound and unsettling than the silence of the misty lake. The fog seemed to muffle the sounds of the outside world, creating a pocket of perfect, tomb-like quiet. Yet this silence did not feel empty. It felt charged, heavy, and watchful. It was a silence that listened. Every tiny, incidental sound was amplified into an event of startling significance. The rustle of a dead leaf, skittering across the stones in a sudden, stray breeze, sounded like the whisper of a dry, sibilant voice. A drop of water, falling from a high, ivy-choked ledge to splash onto a flat stone below, echoed with the sharp, percussive finality of a closing coffin lid. From somewhere deep in the woods that pressed in on the ruins, the distant, mournful hoot of an owl echoed through the still air. A lonely, three-note cry that sounded less like a bird and more like a lament, a sorrowful question who asked of the ghosts that lingered here. The sound sent a shiver crawling up his spine, and the fine hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stood on end. He felt a primal, instinctive sense of being an intruder, a profaner of a sacred, sorrowful place. As he moved deeper into the labyrinth of broken walls, his eyes began to pick out small, heartbreaking details from the chaos of the decay, the tragic traces of a forgotten life. He saw the faint, ghostly outline of a large painting on a section of wall that had been partially sheltered from the elements, the rectangle of cleaner stone a testament to a piece of art that had hung there for years. He saw a child's worn leather shoe, half buried in the mud, its tiny form curled and stiff, a pathetic and lonely artifact of a life cut short. And then, as he carefully navigated a treacherous pile of rubble near what might have been a sitting room, a glint of reflected light caught his eye. He knelt, his curiosity overriding his fear for a moment, and used his fingers to dig into the damp, cold earth. His fingers closed around a small, hard object. He pulled it free and wiped away the mud. It was a single, tarnished silver button, intricately carved with the image of a tiny songbird. It was small, simple, and utterly mundane. Yet holding it in his palm, he felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of connection. This button had been touched by human hands. It had been sewn onto a piece of clothing, perhaps a lady's dress or a gentleman's waistcoat. It had been a part of someone's daily life, a witness to the conversations, the laughter, and the weeping that had once filled these now silent walls. The sheer, crushing weight of all that had been lost, of all the lives that had been lived and extinguished here, settled upon him, and he felt a profound and empathetic sorrow for these nameless, faceless ancestors. He pocketed the small, cold button, the feel of it a solid, grounding presence against his leg, and continued his exploration. He moved from the main hall into a series of smaller, interconnected rooms, or what was left of them. He passed through crumbling archways that led from one desolate, roofless chamber to another. Each space was a new tableau of decay. One room was filled with the skeletal remains of a library, the shelves having rotted and collapsed into a pulpy, indistinguishable mass of what had once been books. Another seemed to have been a kitchen, where a huge, rusted iron stove lay on its side like a dead metal beast. As he moved deeper into the ruins, further away from the entrance and the faint connection to the outside world, the feeling of being watched intensified. It began as a subtle, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind of feeling one gets when they sense a gaze from across a crowded room. But here, in this empty, desolate place, the sensation was amplified into something deeply unnerving. He could not shake the intense, bone-deep certainty that he was not alone. He felt unseen eyes following his every move. They seemed to watch him from the deep, absolute shadows of the crumbling archways, from the dark, gaping maw of the collapsed cellar, from the empty, black rectangles of the upper-story windows. He would stop, his body rigid, and listen, but there was never a sound. He would spin around, his heart pounding, expecting to see a figure standing there, but there was never anything but crumbling stone and creeping ivy. Yet the feeling persisted, a constant, oppressive weight on his consciousness. It was a cold, intelligent, and distinctly malevolent presence. It was not the curious gaze of a woodland animal, but the focused, predatory stare of something that considered him an intruder, a trespasser on its private domain. The ruins were not just empty. They were occupied. The sense of being watched was so powerful, so real, that he began to doubt his own sanity. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his movements becoming jerky and nervous. The silence, which had at first seemed sorrowful, now felt menacing, the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. He felt a desperate urge to call out, to shout, "Who's there?" into the gloom, but a deeper instinct held his tongue, a primal fear that his voice would be answered. He was walking through a memory, but it was not his own. He was an uninvited guest in the memory of the house itself, a house that did not want its tragic past disturbed, a house that guarded its secrets with a chilling, silent hostility. And he knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that whatever was watching him did not want him to leave. The oppressive feeling of being watched, a cold and heavy weight upon his spirit, propelled Philip Feltram forward. To stand still was to surrender to the creeping paranoia, to allow the unseen eyes to pin him in place. He had to keep moving. He made his way through the last of the ruined chambers at the back of the house. A space that might once have been a sunlit parlor or a quiet study, now just another roofless stone box filled with rubble and weeds. He emerged from a crumbling rear archway and found himself facing a solid, impenetrable wall of green. The formal gardens and manicured lawns that must have once surrounded Clustead House were long gone, swallowed by the relentless, encroaching forest. A dense thicket of twisted, ancient trees, mostly hawthorn and blackthorn, pressed in on the ruins, their tangled branches forming a near-solid barrier. But as his eyes scanned the formidable wall of vegetation, searching for a way through, he noticed something. To his left, almost completely swallowed by a cluster of thorny, aggressive-looking bushes, was the faint, ghostly suggestion of a path. It was not a clear path, not by any means. It was more like a memory of a path, a subtle depression in the earth and a slight thinning of the undergrowth that hinted at a route once frequently traveled. It was barely wide enough for one person, and it seemed to lead away from the imposing ruin of the house, plunging directly into the dark, unwelcoming heart of the thicket. A rational man would have turned back. The path led to nowhere but deeper into the overgrown, forgotten woods. But Philip was no longer a rational man. He was a man driven by a compulsion he didn't understand, guided by the whispers of a family tragedy. He felt the same inexplicable pull that had drawn him across the lake and into the ruins, now urging him down this forgotten track. It was a faint, yet undeniable summons. This was the way. With a sense of grim determination, he turned and began to push his way into the thorny embrace of the thicket. The journey was a battle. The path, barely visible at its entrance, seemed to fight his every step. Thorny branches, sharp as needles, snagged at his coat and tore at his skin, leaving thin, red scratches on his hands and face. Overhanging limbs, heavy with damp moss, slapped against him, showering him with cold, musty-smelling water. The air under the dense canopy of trees was cool and still, and the light faded dramatically, plunging him into a deep, green-tinged gloom. The sounds of the outside world, already muted by the fog, disappeared completely, replaced by the intimate, claustrophobic sounds of his own struggle. The rasp of his own breathing, the loud crack of a dry twig under his boot, the ripping sound of fabric as a particularly vicious thorn caught hold of his sleeve. It felt as though the woods themselves were a living entity, a hostile guardian actively trying to repel him, to keep him from discovering whatever lay at the end of this forgotten path. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, but here, in the close, tangled confines of the thicket, it felt different. It was no longer a distant, unseen gaze, but something close, something moving with him, just beyond the screen of leaves, a silent, shadowy escort through the hostile terrain. After what felt like an eternity of struggling through the grasping, tearing vegetation, the path suddenly opened up, and he stumbled out of the thicket into a clearing. He stopped, breathing heavily, and stared at the scene before him. He had found what was once the garden. But it was not a place of beauty or tranquility. It was a nightmarish, tangled ruin. A garden that had been allowed to run wild for a century, transforming into a place of savage and untamed hostility. It was a roughly circular space, perhaps an acre in size, surrounded on all sides by the dark, menacing wall of the woods. The layout of a formal garden was still faintly discernible, the ghost of a circular path, the suggestion of flower beds now choked with monstrous weeds, but it had been utterly consumed by a wild and aggressive nature. It was a maze of thorny, woody vines that snaked across the ground and climbed the trunks of the few skeletal fruit trees that still stood, their dead branches reaching for the gray sky like desperate, pleading arms. Huge, thick briar patches, some as tall as a man, formed impenetrable walls of thorns, their dark berries looking like drops of congealed blood. The air was thick with the sweet, sickly smell of damp, decaying vegetation and the faint, bitter scent of some unknown, night-blooming flower. This was not a garden of life. It was a garden of decay, a place where beauty had curdled into something monstrous and threatening. He stood at the edge of this thorny wilderness, a profound sense of unease settling over him. This place felt even older and more sorrowful than the house. It felt like the true heart of the tragedy, a place of deep, primal grief. The silence here was absolute, a dead, heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all thought. But as he stood, listening, he began to hear a soft, almost inaudible sound. It was the whisper-faint rustle of thousands of leaves, stirred by a breeze that he could not feel on his skin. It was a constant, dry, sibilant sound, like 1,000 voices whispering secrets just at the edge of hearing. The sound seemed to come from all around him, a disembodied chorus that filled the air with a sense of ancient, sorrowful conversation. He felt, with a chilling certainty, that this was a place where the dead still spoke. His eyes scanned the tangled, hostile landscape, searching for he knew not what. He only knew that the pull, the summons, had led him here, to this specific place. And then he saw it. In the very center of the ruined garden, in the middle of what had probably once been a central lawn, he saw a single solitary object that did not belong. It was a stone. It was a small, simple gravestone, tilted at a sharp, drunken angle, half sunk into the soft, damp earth as if the ground were slowly trying to swallow it whole. It was not tall or ornate, but small and humble, a marker of a modest, almost forgotten burial. A thick, verdant blanket of dark green moss covered most of its surface, camouflaging it almost perfectly, making it seem like just another natural feature of the overgrown garden. But it was undeniably a man-made object, a final, lonely sentinel in this wilderness of decay. His heart began to pound a heavy, painful rhythm against his ribs. This was it. This had to be it. He began to move toward it, his progress slow and difficult. The thorny vines seemed to grasp at his ankles, and the thick briars tore at his clothes with a renewed viciousness, as if the garden were making one last, desperate attempt to protect its secret. He finally reached the center of the clearing and stood before the lonely, tilted stone. The air around it felt even colder, the silence even more profound. He knelt on the damp earth, his knees sinking into the soft ground, and a sense of profound, almost religious, solemnity washed over him. He was trespassing on sacred ground. With a trembling, reverent hand, he began to clear away the thick, damp moss. It came away in wet, heavy clumps, revealing the cold, gray stone beneath. The stone was pitted and weathered, its surface rough to the touch. It had been ravaged by a century of wind, rain, and ice. As he cleared the last of the moss from the face of the gravestone, he leaned in close, his breath clouding in the cold air, and tried to decipher the inscription. It was almost completely gone. The carved letters had been scoured and smoothed by time, worn away until they were little more than faint, ghostly suggestions in the stone. He traced the indentations with his fingertips, trying to read the stone as a blind man would read, feeling for the shape of the words. Most of it was indecipherable, a meaningless collection of smooth, shallow grooves. It was hopeless. He felt a wave of crushing disappointment wash over him. He had come all this way, followed the ghostly summons, only to be met with a final, unbreachable silence. But then, as his fingers traced the very center of the stone, he felt it. A sequence of letters that were carved just a little deeper than the rest. A name that had stubbornly resisted the relentless erosion of time. His heart stopped. He squinted, tilting his head to catch the faint, gray light in just the right way. And he saw it. Faint, weathered, but still undeniably there. A single, heartbreaking word. Mary. The name hung in the air. A silent, spoken word in the dead quiet of the garden. Mary. It was her. Mary Feltram. His ancestor. She wasn't lost in the lake, as the legends claimed. She was here. She had been here all along, buried in this forgotten, unconsecrated ground. Her final resting place guarded by a hostile garden and the slow, creeping passage of time. He stared at the name. A storm of emotions swirling within him: pity, sorrow, a strange, familial anger at the injustice of it all. This was not the grave of a beloved wife or mother. This was the grave of a secret, a woman hidden away in death as she had been in life, her memory deliberately and cruelly erased from the world. A profound, aching sadness for this woman he had never known, but whose tragic blood ran in his own veins, overwhelmed him, and he felt the hot sting of tears in his eyes. He had found her. He had answered the call. But as he knelt there, staring at her lonely, forgotten name, he had the terrible feeling that finding the grave was not the end of the mystery, but only the very beginning. The secrets of this place were not buried with the dead. They were carved in stone, waiting for the right person to come and read them. He knelt there in the oppressive silence of the ruined garden, the cold, damp earth seeping through the knees of his trousers, his entire world having shrunk to the small, moss-stained gravestone before him. The single, weathered word, Mary, was a brand on his consciousness, a focal point for all the sorrow and mystery that saturated the very air of Clustead. A profound and aching grief for this lost ancestor, this woman whose tragedy was the dark and secret foundation of his own existence, washed over him. He felt a desperate, almost primal need for connection, a longing to bridge the century of silence that separated him from her story. It was more than just curiosity now. It was a deeply personal quest. The letter had been a map, the ruins a landmark, and this lonely grave was the destination. But the destination was a locked box, its secrets still sealed within the silent, unyielding stone. Driven by an instinct he did not understand and could not have explained, an impulse born of a deep and desperate empathy, Philip reached out and placed his hand flat against the cold, weathered surface of the gravestone. His palm covered the faint, tragic name. The stone was icy cold, its chill a stark and shocking contrast to the warmth of his own living flesh. It was a cold that felt ancient and unnatural, as if it were not merely the absence of heat, but a presence in itself, a cold drawn from the deep, sunless earth and the sorrow of the one who lay beneath. He closed his eyes, shutting out the bleak, gray light of the overgrown garden, and focused all his thought, all his will, on the single point of contact between his hand and the stone. He tried to project his own sense of kinship, of sorrow, of a desperate need to understand, into the stone, as if his own vitality could somehow awaken a dormant memory within it. He whispered her name into the dead air, his voice a hoarse, broken sound. Mary! For a long moment, nothing happened. There was only the cold stone beneath his palm, the oppressive silence, and the faint, sibilant rustle of the dead leaves that surrounded him. He felt a fool. He was a grown man, kneeling in a ruined garden, trying to commune with a gravestone. The weight of his own desperate, romantic folly settled upon him, and he was about to pull his hand away, to surrender to the finality of the silence. But then it began. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that trembled through the stone and into his palm, a low, deep hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth. He held his breath, his heart frozen in his chest, and then he felt it through his closed eyelids. A change in the light, a soft, otherworldly luminescence was beginning to bloom against the darkness of his own perception. His eyes snapped open. He stared, his mind refusing to accept what his senses were screaming at him. The stone beneath his hand was glowing. It was not a reflection of some hidden light source, nor a trick of the pale, gray daylight. A faint, cold, and ethereal light was beginning to pulse from within the gravestone itself. It was a soft, pale blue, the color of a winter moon seen through a thin veil of ice, and it emanated directly from the ancient, carved letters of Mary's name. The light grew steadily in intensity, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a faint and spectral heart. The single word, Mary, once barely visible, was now a line of sharp, clear, and luminous blue fire, burning with a cold and silent energy against the dark, damp gray of the stone. The sight was so impossible, so fundamentally contrary to all the laws of nature he had ever known, that for a moment he thought he had gone mad. He felt a wave of vertigo, as if the very ground beneath him had become unstable. He should have recoiled in terror, snatched his hand away from the unnatural phenomenon, and fled from that haunted garden without looking back. But he was mesmerized, held captive by the sheer, terrifying beauty of the sight. The ghostly blue light cast his own face and hand in a ghastly, spectral glow, and it pushed back the gloom of the garden, throwing the twisted, thorny shapes of the briars into sharp, monstrous relief. The whispering of the leaves seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the spirits of the garden were stirring, awakened by this unholy beacon. And as the unearthly light reached its full, pulsing brightness, something new and even more impossible began to happen. The light began to spread. Thin, luminous, spiderweb-like lines of the same pale blue fire began to creep outward from the glowing name, tracing paths across the face of the stone that had been completely invisible before. These were other words, fainter, more delicate letters, etched into the stone with a lighter hand. Letters that had been utterly erased by time and weather, now being revealed, resurrected by the ghostly, supernatural light. Philip stared, his breath catching in his throat, as a full, cryptic, and chilling message materialized in the glowing script, forming a sentence around the central, burning name. The words were archaic, their meaning veiled, but their message was a shard of ice in his heart. The glowing inscription read, "A son to the earth, a daughter to the shadow. The twin star seeks the lake's embrace." He read the words once, then twice, his mind struggling to grasp their terrifying implication. A son to the earth. That must refer to a burial, a child laid to rest in the ground. Here, perhaps even in this very grave with his mother. But the second part, a daughter to the shadow. What could that possibly mean? And then the final, chilling line. The twin star seeks the lake's embrace. Twin. The word exploded in his mind with the force of a physical blow. Not one child, as the letter had suggested, as all the whispers had hinted. Two. There were two children. Twins. A boy, buried here with his mother, and a girl, a daughter, given to the shadow, whose fate was somehow tied to the lake. The legend of the drowned woman, The story of Mary Feltram holding her child was not wrong, merely incomplete. It was the daughter she held. It was the daughter whose ghost was trapped in the cold, dark water. The full, horrifying weight of the revelation crashed down upon him. The secret of Clwstyd was not just a hidden child, but a hidden twin, one buried, one drowned. Their fates cruelly and deliberately separated. The injustice of it was a physical sickness that rose in his throat. This was not just a tragedy. It was a monstrous, calculated act of cruelty. A secret so dark it had to be split in two, one half buried in the earth, the other submerged in the water, both erased from history. As this understanding solidified in his mind, the ghostly blue light that illuminated the terrible message held for one final, terrifying moment, burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. And then, as if an unseen switch had been thrown, it flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the garden back into the deep, oppressive gloom of the afternoon. The sudden return to darkness was so abrupt, so absolute, that it left him momentarily blind, the spectral blue afterimage of the inscription still burning behind his eyes. In the instant the light vanished, a sudden, violent, and unnaturally cold gust of wind swept through the ruined garden. It tore through the thicket with a furious, roaring sound, whipping the thorny branches into a frenzy and sending a shower of dead leaves swirling around him. The wind was icy, a blast of pure, arctic cold that seemed to come not from a change in the weather, but from the grave itself, an exhalation of pure, concentrated rage and sorrow. And carried on that sudden, icy wind, a sound reached his ears, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was the faint, but unmistakable sound of a woman weeping. It was not the sound of human grief. It was a thin, high, ethereal wail, filled with a century of loss, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. The weeping rose in pitch, culminating in a single, heart-shattering sob that seemed to come from directly behind him. So close he felt a phantom breath on the back of his neck. He cried out, a raw, involuntary scream of pure terror, and scrambled backwards, falling onto the damp earth, his hands sinking into the mud. He crab-walked away from the grave, his eyes wide with horror, staring at the now dark and silent stone. The wind died as suddenly as it had come, and the garden fell back into its profound, dead silence. The weeping was gone, but the memory of it, the feeling of that spectral sorrow, was now a permanent part of him. He lay there on the cold ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably, alone in the center of the haunted garden. He had found the truth he had been seeking, but it was a truth far more terrible than he could ever have imagined. He had unearthed a secret that had been buried for 100 years, and in doing so, he had awakened the terrible, sorrowful ghost that guarded it. He was no longer just a descendant discovering a family history. He was now a part of the haunting itself. A cryptic message on a haunted grave, glowing with an unholy light. The mystery of Mary Feltram deepens, pointing not to one lost child, but two. What does this ghostly inscription mean? And is the grave itself cursed? Tell us your theories below. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.